start. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this new AJR online event. My name is Deborah Barnes, and I run AJR's My Story Book Testimony project. I'm second generation myself, and I was organising the two-day international forum on the second generation, which was due to be held at the end of April, and was sadly cancelled. This is the first online event we're running, which has been taken from the programme of the forum, and we hope to run some more in the near future. It's nice to see some familiar faces here today, but for anyone who's not familiar with AJR, we are the national charity supporting Britain's Jewish refugees and survivors of Nazi oppression and their families, and we are committed to the education of others about the Holocaust. For more information about our work, please go to our website or follow us on Twitter and Facebook. I should imagine that by now everyone is very familiar with Zoom. We have a lot of people here today with us, so we're going to keep everyone except for our guest speakers on mute. However, should there be time at the end of the session for questions, please wave either virtually or physically, and we will unmute you so that you can ask your question. My colleagues Alex Moores and Carol Hart will be looking out for your comments. Please limit yourself to one short question. I would also say that if there is interest in doing so, we would be happy to arrange a follow-up session on another day when there would be more opportunity for you to speak. We're delighted to welcome David, Teresa and Rosemary as our speakers today to discuss the emotional impact of visits to places connected with family history. So David, over to you, and I'll just unmute you. So you can speak.
Okay.
There you go.
Okay. Thank you. So the three of us are members of Second Generation Network, and it is through the network that I came to the idea for this project. Many accounts of such journeys undertaken by Second Generation to places connected with family history have appeared in Second Generation Voices, our magazine that comes out 3 times a year. Second Generation Network was set up in 1995 after 2 very successful conferences on second generation were held in London on the issue of second generation, that is the children and descendants of Holocaust survivors and refugees from Nazi persecution. We're not the only second generation group in this country. There are quite a few others. But we have a nationwide membership with many events in London, partly at the Wiener Library, JW3, Jewish Book Week. But we also have regional groups in Bristol, East Midlands, Manchester and Leeds, Thames Valley, and we even have a 3rd generation group in Manchester. So there's been a steady stream of accounts concerning these kinds of journeys connected with family history. In March of 2011, I ran a workshop in Germany on the burdens of history at a conference held near Frankfurt. And I was highlighting the challenges involved in such journeys, as well as the human encounters and interactions along the way. Last year, I presented a paper, a conference paper, at a Holocaust conference in Ukraine, and as a result, really determined to edit a book on the topic. And I gathered a few people together. We now have 12 contributors. We held 2 meetings to begin with, and Teresa joined me as my co-editor. We're now halfway through the writing up process for this book. So I think Teresa will now take over. Is it that so? Or it's
Rosemary.
Yeah.
Rosemary.
Rosemary will speak first, will she? Okay. So Rosemary Schonfeld has written a book about her family history and her search for her aunt, and will talk to us about her trips to the Czech Republic, mainly. So over to you, Rosemary, then.
Okay, thank you, David. And thank you everyone for coming. We've been given 10 minutes each, and as all of you know, talking about the Holocaust on any subject and limiting it to 10 minutes is quite a challenge. So I'm just going to jump straight in and touch on 3 visits of mine back to the Czechoslovakia. Was my first visit in 1992. When it was still Czechoslovakia, and 2 subsequent visits to the Czech Republic. I need to give a little background about my father because that's particularly relevant in terms of the 3rd visit. My father was a Czech refugee. I got to England in 1939. He and his 2 sisters got out. His parents and brothers didn't. He married my mother during the war in 1942. My eldest brother was born, and they'd always planned to go back. At the end of the war, they were going to settle in Czechoslovakia. My father did go back first to establish himself, got a job. He was a civil engineer, got a flat in Prague, was there for a year. My mother was poised to join him, and then the communists seized power in the power sharing government, and my father then had to escape again from his homeland. And managed to get back to England. We emigrated to Canada when I was 5. He had planned to go back to visit Czechoslovakia in 1968. He was making his travel plans, and then again the Russian tanks moved in. He couldn't go. He died in 1985 before the Prague Spring. So he was never able to go back to his homeland. So the first time I went back was in 1992. I went for a few days with a German friend. I knew very little still about my father's family. I didn't know he'd been Jewish. That had been hidden from us. I knew about the Holocaust. Their fates had been explained in a different way. But I felt I really wanted to connect with the Slav, connect with the Slav spirit, which I felt I had in me, and spent a few days in Prague. Absolutely loved it. I went with a German friend. We did go to the Jewish quarter, and we visited the synagogues there. But overall, it was a very positively powerful, pleasurable experience. Sort of, even though Prague at that point was still covered in Soviet grime. It hadn't been cleaned up yet, but it was very cheap. We were able to go to symphony orchestra concerts, and I really felt it resonated. Something really resonated with me. I felt I'd made a little connection, even though I didn't know a word of the language. My second visit was in the year 2000, and between 1992 and the year 2000, a lot had happened in terms of my exploring my 2nd generation legacy. I found the Bristol 2nd generation group. I'm really pleased to see at least 2 members are joining this meeting, which has been hugely important to me, that group. And through that, I determined to see whether I could find out more about my father's family. Mainly my aunt by marriage. She'd been married to one of my father's brothers. All I knew was that she'd survived. My uncle hadn't. I didn't know where they'd ended up. I still didn't know my father had been Jewish. So in the 90s, I determined to try and find out more. This was in the era before the internet and email, so everything was by letter. And eventually I did find Relly, who had been married to my father's brother. And she was alive and well and living in Sydney, Australia. In 1998, it was when I managed to trace her. Between the year 2000 and 2010, when she died, I visited her 5 times in Sydney. She was an extraordinary woman, no bitterness, just exceptional. Privileged to have known her. And I have written a book about that journey, which I will now try and screen share, if I can, just so it's called Finding Relly, My Family, the Holocaust and Me. And that is it. Are you seeing it? Whoops.
Yes.
Yep. Okay.
Yeah.
Good. Now I seem to have lost Zoom.
The top of the screen, it'll.
Oh, thank you. Okay. Right, so that was that's the book about finding Relly. I don't know how to get rid of it now. Just
It's stop usually.
there. Okay, there we are back.
You did it.
Thank you. I did practice. It's gone. Okay, so anyway, that because of finding Relly, I was able to find out a lot more about my father's family. I found out my father had been Jewish. I found out names of places, etc. So when I went in 2000, it was a bit of a pilgrimage. I went with my partner. We drove around visiting relevant places where my father had grown up. I didn't know, I still had no addresses. But things like where he went to university in Brno. We went to Theresienstadt, and I went to Yestebnik, was one of the places I went, which was Relly's home village. And I sent her a picture, which to me felt symbolic, of me standing under the village sign of Yestebnik with a kind of, it felt like a little bit of defiance that, they didn't annihilate everybody and I'd come back. So there's a lot more I could say about that, of course, but that was the visit in 2000. And then my third visit was in 2012. As I said, my father had never been able to return to his home country. And my eldest brother suggested that we take his ashes back ourselves. So we did. And we scattered his ashes in a little stream outside Olomouc that fed into the Morava River, which ended up, feeding into the Danube eventually. But alongside this purpose, we were also meeting with connections we'd made in the few years through the Ostrovac community, in the few years sort of between 2000 and 2012. The Ostrovac community is the link between Ostrava in the Czech Republic, and it's now all over the world, that was established when the sacred scroll from the Ostrava synagogue was discovered in the Kingston upon Thames synagogue, because when the sacred scrolls had been sort of smuggled out of Czechoslovakia in the 60s, they went to the Westminster synagogue, and they're distributed to different synagogues around the country. Somebody in the year 2000 discovered the Ostrava scroll, and thus the link was established. And an extraordinary archivist in Ostrava, Liba Salamonovic, she's retired, a retired archivist, but she now devotes a lot of her time to unearthing information for people like me whose families came from Ostrava. Thanks to her, we were able to locate my father's apartment where he'd lived in Moravska Ostrava. We'd had a Stolperstein laid. When we went back, we met she was able to take us to the municipal archives. We saw a lot of paperwork, like my father's school reports. We were taken to the memorial statue of the train station where the deportations had left to go east from Ostrava. We went for lunch. We were taken for lunch in a pub directly opposite my father's apartment building, where the Stolperstein was, which was there when my father lived there. The waiter, when we had lunch, he realized who we were. It turned out he lived in that block of flats. He very kindly offered to take us across to look in his flat where he lived with his mother, so we'd have an idea of what the flat was where my father lived. So there was a lot packed in to that last visit, and that is when the psychological impact of what's sometimes called the transmission of massive trauma kicked in with a vengeance, because sometimes that manifests in physically with, I think, with some people. It's something a lot of second generation people experience. For me, it goes to my lungs. In Chinese medicines, they say lungs is where the lungs are where grief is stored. And I've always had problems with my lungs, really. Well, I'm a very healthy person, but if something goes wrong, it's my lungs. And so 2 days before this trip, I developed tracheobronchitis. I couldn't cancel. I wasn't contagious. I knew that. I couldn't cancel. Too much appointments. Everything was in place. My brother was arriving from a different country. So I went and I coughed my way through the entire visit. I could not stop coughing. I drove myself mad. I must have driven everybody mad. And it was embarrassing, but that's what happened. And then as soon as I left the Czech Republic and got home, it was gone. So I just thought I'd mention that as a kind of example of how the emotional impact can sometimes manifest. And then to finish, I'd like to screen share one more thing, one more picture, just as an example. Try screen share again. And right, can you see that picture?
Yes.
Yep, that's my grandmother. I got this picture in 2017. I had no idea what my grandparents looked like. The first picture I'd ever seen of my father's family, of anyone of my father's family, was that picture, the cover of my book. That was Relly and Moritz's wedding photo, which she sent me a copy of. I'd never seen a picture before. And this one, Liebe Salomonovich found in the archives of Theresienstadt. This was taken on my grandmother's admission to Theresienstadt. And she ended up in Treblinka. But I mention this because this was 2017, not long ago. And for many of us, we are continuing our search. It's not over. It's an ongoing journey. So I'll finish now, and thank you for listening. Right.
Thank you, Rosemary. Teresa? Okay. Oh, back to David.
Teresa is going to speak now, I think.
Yes. All right. I'm going to talk about a visit to Berlin that I made with my father in 2001. And although at the beginning of the talk, I described some things we did, it isn't the description of the trip itself that's important. It's more the thinking that emerged from it. And what I'm going to do, it's all on PowerPoint, but I shall speak to it as we go along, and you'll see there's some images and there are also some words on the screen, as well as what I'm going to say. So here we go. Let's see if it works. Okay. So, the beginning, I'll just provide a little bit of the history, and then I'll talk about what I witnessed and in turn discovered about my dad, and what he'd been carrying emotionally, and in turn what I was in touch with my whole life. And really until now, writing this presentation, I really began to get in touch with. And as with all transmission of trauma, it's often staring us in the face so closely that we don't see it until we've been able to disentangle it. So to start with, here's a picture of my dad when he was 90 with my son in 2010 on the left. And then the year he left Berlin when he was 15. I'm very struck by how sensitive he looks and young. The visit was significant because although my dad had visited Berlin many times before, he'd not been since the fall of the wall, and he'd never been to any of the places of memory. And interestingly, we stayed in the Kempinski that was paid for by the city. And he told me that that's where his mother had taken him when he passed his exams and had a specialty. The visit was significant, yeah. The first place we were taken to was the Jewish cemetery at Weissensee. And what was interesting, my dad did not expect to find the grave of anybody that he knew. His grandparents had been buried there, he knew that, but he was quite sure it was going to have been wrecked by the Nazis. But we did find his grandparents' grave, my great-grandparents' grave. It was on the ground. I won't show you this video because, you know, we can keep going. But he had it reconstructed. But for me, it was something very significant to have had this, to know their names, to know the dates they were born, and they really did exist, because prior to that, it was just like some kind of fantasy idea. The next place we went to was a place called Plötzensee, which is, as many of you may know, is a place of execution, absolutely horrific place. And I show this because even though my dad never knew about this place, I think it really reinforces the kind of atmosphere of terror that existed during the Nazi time in Berlin. And in 1934, at the age of 13, he had to leave school. He was expelled because he walked out of a Nazi-style morning assembly and got on his school report that he'd put himself outside of the community, which I understand is an expression that's used for a lot of things at that time by the Nazis. And then 2 years later, a bit more than 2 years later, he was forced to leave Germany, and he came alone, not on the Kindertransport, it was before that. And the next place we went to was a place called Rosenstrasse, which was interesting for me because it was the first time that I'd seen my dad not look like a fish out of water. He suddenly looked to be at home. Now I'm going to just try something just so you can just hear a little bit of his voice, because he stood there and translated the German into English, because many of the people on this tour who were with us.
He was a judge, a former judge actually. I asked him what's going on. He said to me that all Jews should have to take their personal effects and have to congregate downstairs in the casino. I take my briefcase in which I've got my breakfast, my jacket and my cap, and I go down into this room. Several at the table, several gentlemen from the Gestapo and a number of SS people running to and fro. After all Jewish forced laborers, women and men have been collected in this room. Special treatment, 125 men.
So it was absolutely astounding for me to stand there listening to him speaking English but reading German and feeling like this was his place, and I had never seen that before in him. The next place was even more significant, which was the memorial to the Auschwitz transports. And we were standing there looking at it in some awe, it has to be said, and because it's huge. And my dad turned to me and said, I've just realized something. If I'd not left when I did, I'd not be here now, neither would you. It's quite a thought, isn't it? It was like something he'd already known, but didn't know or couldn't allow himself to know. And the idea that he might have been murdered in Auschwitz had never consciously occurred to him before. And that was something that I'd carried my whole life. I knew somehow that being a refugee had been an extremely traumatic experience for him, and that he'd run away from something very frightening, but he hadn't taken it in a way. So to avoid that fate, he'd escaped to England. But that was not for long. He then, after 4 years of studying and trying to work, he had the infamous experience of being interned as an enemy alien on the Dinera to Australia. And the whole experience shocked him. And he spent quite a lot of time while interned writing letters to important people explaining the injustice of it all. But this was one experience he could never talk about. I had to sort of unearth all this in a way. And after he died, I discovered in his filing cabinet a whole load of diaries and letters and photographs and drawings, including this, where he mapped the journey, because they had no idea where they were going. They were just all piled onto the ship and sent off to the other side of the world. After the war, we went to New Zealand. And he got that idea because on the way back from internment, he'd seen New Zealand from the sea, and it was love at first sight. And he loved it. There's no doubt about that. But the problem was, there was always something going on in the background. And although, as my father was fond of telling people, it's on the other side of the world, as far away as you could possibly get, he wanted to forget and start afresh. And it's not so easy. See, here you have a picture of young children, white, Pakeha, as we say in New Zealand, and Māori, doing Nazi, that's interesting, Māori war dances and cultural dances. But this yellow star was always somehow in the background, even though I didn't know about the yellow star as a child. Now we're back in Berlin at the Bundestag, and I heard my dad ask a question. At the time it seemed strange. I didn't understand where it came from, but recently I understood the subtext. So I'll play you this and see if I can, so you can hear his voice, how trembling it was.
The common agricultural policy. Do you think that there may be any chance that the common agricultural policy will be more attuned to the general tendency throughout the world towards free trade? See, I come from New Zealand, which is a country which is completely free trade. We have an agriculture that is in no way subsidized. It has to stand on its own feet. And we see that here in Europe, people, sometimes large firms who pretend to be peasants, get very heavily subsidized, not just to grow food for their own needs, but to grow large quantities of excess food, which they then sell at very low prices in the world markets, which disturb our trade and that of Australia, for instance, and Canada and other countries. Is there any chance that one of these days, these terrible borders around the EU will fall?
And I thought, where's that come from? And realized much later that it was a response to his lingering feeling of feeling shut out, or as he would say, chucked out from his country of birth. And as I've written there, the past revealed itself in the present. But actually overnight, his whole demeanor and mood changed. He became agitated and lost his pleasure at being there. And I didn't understand what was happening. Slowly, I've unpicked what was going on. He had felt enormous gratitude at being invited to return to his city of birth. But the trip had put him in touch with the long-buried humiliation of being chucked out. And the effect it had on me was that he was just very difficult to be with until he left. And when he left, he just went straight out of the airport without turning to wave goodbye. And I stood there feeling, goodness, what have I done? Which was a familiar experience and very often experience of second generation. Anyway, before he died, he told me two things, which I think were really important. One was And he was constantly talking about Germany and why he didn't want to go back, and yet he loved it and so on. Very, very bothered by it all. And as he said, as I was walking along Kufersendam, I heard a cyclist shout, "Get out!" He didn't hear it of the way, but that probably he did. And then he said, "I don't know. I know it doesn't make sense, but I feel shame for not having been able to stop what happened." And what I've learned, that these were clues that have provided some relief. And although I felt some relief at being told those things at the time, I did not fully understand what he was telling me. And according to an article written by Phil Leask, I understood that shame for my father was a way of protecting himself, of being reminded of his humiliation, not but once, but twice. So what I began to understand, that the question in the Bundestag in Germany was not only revealing, but also intensely courageous. He was actually saying, "Why did you lock me out? And I still feel the pain of this." It was something I'd always known about, but could not name. And as a result, something changed very fundamentally in our relationship. This is a picture taken on my wedding day. Until I got it out the other day, I'd never seen the love on his face until now. I always felt he was emotionally remote and extremely volatile, and I thought he didn't love me. But as a result of our time in Berlin, I found a new dad, warm and not so remote. And I began to understand the pain he carried. It lifted a load from my shoulders. Now I no longer feel his pain, but instead feel my own sadness for him. Thank you.
Thank you, Rosemary.
I'm not Rosemary.
Sorry. Thank you, Teresa. I'm looking at Rosemary. I'm so sorry.
That's fine.
Getting everybody mixed up. That was very emotional.
Right.
David.
Yes. Thank you. I will be talking about journeys to places I undertook, even to places that I had already visited previously as a child. So it's going back to places that I already knew, but in a different way. Invariably, each journey that we're talking about involves an inner journey as well as a physical journey. So first, I want to talk about my trip to Berlin in September 2001, on the occasion of the opening of the Jewish Museum in Berlin. I was really excited about this trip. I was undertaking at the time a PhD dissertation on Jewish museums in Italy. And I was really keen to be there for the opening of the Berlin Museum. But also I was going there as a press representative for Jewish Renaissance, an arts and culture magazine based in London. And it was just being launched at the time. So I was excited to go to this place that I, in some ways, already knew. I'd been there as a child from the 1950s, late 50s onwards, visiting my grandparents. It turns out that both my parents were born in Berlin. They're from vastly different backgrounds. My father's parents were trade union activists and later communists, and had spent the First World War opposing the war on either side. So they met in London in 1913 when my grandmother came from Vienna to help recruit women workers in Hackney into the trade union movement. And she briefly met my grandfather there. But they were separated by the First World War. My grandfather, my British grandfather, was refused to join the British Army and sent to prison for doing hard labor. she went off to Berlin to campaign against the First World War. And what she saw was the heart of the problem, as it were, at the time. They met after the war again in Berlin, got married, and my father was born in 1923. 10 years later, with the rise of Nazism, they were given 24 hours to leave the country as persona non grata, and they came back to London. My mother's family, on the other hand, were well established in Berlin from a middle-class background, reasonably assimilated. They kept Friday evenings and went to synagogue for the major festivals. Her father, Sigmund Weltlinger, had fought in the First World War in the German army, and back in civilian life, he had set up a financial journal and later joined the stock market as a stockbroker. But in the mid-30s, he was forced to leave as a stockbroker and had to seek employment elsewhere, became an administrator for the Jewish community. He was arrested straight after Kristallnacht and sent to Sachsenhausen concentration camp. He was there only for a few weeks, released early, but the experience of being there never left him. He was determined to get his children out into safety and managed to get them on the Kindertransport. My mother arriving in London, January of 39, and my uncle in Manchester, May, June 39. Their parents, however, carried on living in Berlin until January 1943, when the offices of the Jewish community were closed down and they had to go into hiding. At first, they were in safe houses on the outskirts of town, but soon were able to come back to Berlin and found shelter within a Christian Scientist family, the Moerings, who felt that they were doing their Christian duty by sheltering them. After the war, my grandfather stayed in Berlin, became the representative for Jewish affairs for the Berlin magistrate, and in 1949, jointly founded the Christian Jewish Cooperation Society in Berlin, the equivalent really of this CCJ in this country. And shortly after that, he joined politics and became deputy in the Berlin Senate, and eventually became one of the city's elders, not only in the Senate, but for the city as well. In 1965, on the occasion of the visit to Berlin by Her Majesty the Queen, he was actually introduced to Her Majesty, and here is a photo of him being introduced to Her Majesty the Queen. And you might be able to see Willy Brandt in between the two of them, then Mayor of Berlin and later Chancellor. I had visited them in the late 50s and 60s when I was a child, stayed with them and got to know them a bit, played cards with them, went on outings, and even joined them on holiday a couple of times in Switzerland. I had also visited my great aunt in Berlin, Lisa Rosenthal, who had fled to Italy just before the war and after the war spent half of her time in Italy and half of her time in Berlin, and I visited her in both places. Also visited her, as I said, in Italy at a time in the 1950s when I was actually living in Italy myself. So I had been to Berlin before, but this, in 2001, was the first time I had actually got to Berlin when none of my relatives, none of the people that I had been visiting in Berlin were there. By then, they were all dead. And I had not been prepared for coming to Berlin when they weren't there. It was a big shock to me. I was lost, inconsolable. I didn't know what to do with myself. I arrived there on the Thursday and just didn't know what to do. Fortunately, before leaving London, I had contacted Rabbi Walter Rothschild, who had been a community rabbi in Berlin at the time, and I had met him a few times at the Limud conference in England, a conference that I'd been going to since 1986. He invited me for his family Shabbat meals, and I was glad to accept the invitation. Also, he did far more for me than that. He was able to arrange for me to get a press pass for the opening of the Berlin Museum. And he took me along with him to Shabbat services on the Friday evening to an Orthodox synagogue where a 12-year-old was having her bat mitzvah. She came from a Russian background, and she was the first in her family to have a bar or bar mitzvah. The family was hugely proud and happy at this occasion. The next morning, I was taken to the Oranienburger Strasse synagogue, where there too, in a reform service this time, a bat mitzvah was taking place. Indeed, it was the bat mitzvah of the daughter of Daniel Liebeskind, the very architect of the Berlin Jewish Museum. And here in Berlin, although I was suffering from my own private grief, I was also witnessing the rebirth of a new and vital Jewish community where East meets West. And a Jewish museum is launched with great fanfare, with a new hope for the future. Next, I want to talk about my trip to Prague in 1992. My first visit to Prague had been in April 1982. We had been living in Vienna at the time, that is myself, my sister, my mother, as a single parent family. My parents by then were separated.
Okay.
We saw the usual tourist sites, even tried to get into the Jewish Museum. It was closed at the time, but one of the caretakers was able to show us some of the exhibits in one of the synagogues. It did not mean much to me at the time. I'd been brought up mainly as a secular Jew, though I had a sort of a bar mitzvah in the big synagogue in Rome. But that is another story. But really, we had little contact with the Jewish community anywhere in all our previous journeys. On the last afternoon with my mother in Prague, we visited the main Jewish cemetery where Kafka was buried. I'd heard of him. My father had mentioned some of his stories and books. That night, my mother died. She had breathed in the fumes from a faulty stove in a basement flat. It took a while for me to find out what had happened to her. I went to the British consulate, and they arranged to send me back to Vienna on the train, where my father would pick myself and my sister up and take us back to Pakistan, where he had a one-year contract at the time. Several weeks later, my mother was buried in the very same cemetery in which Kafka was lying. Nobody came to her funeral. There was no shiva, no stone setting ceremony, nothing at all to mark the mourning process. I was completely bereft, without any guidance or support, merely grieving inside of myself. No tears, and unable to voice my feelings. I was numb. 30 years later, in 1992, I was able to go back to Prague, visit her graveside. I was a changed person. I'd grown up and had much to tell her. In 1976, I married a young woman from a German Jewish refugee background, brought up in London in an Orthodox household. We had twin sons a year later, and in 1982, joined our nearest synagogue, Wimbledon Reform Synagogue, so that our children could go to Sunday classes, have a Jewish education, and appreciate their Jewish heritage. I too was to gain a Jewish education, learn to read Hebrew, follow the prayer book, and indeed became a warden in the synagogue. As I mentioned before, I joined Limud Conference in 1986 and had been going there on a regular basis ever since. When I visited the Jewish Museum in Prague in 1992, I recognized many of the ritual objects that I was now using both in the home and in the synagogue. I felt very much at home in my Judaism and felt part of the Jewish community at large in a way that as a child I had felt apart from it. I was able to say all this at my mother's graveside, and I was able to recite the Kaddish, really taking part in a mourning process in a way that had been closed off to me until then. My journey did not end there, and neither did the grieving or mourning. It carries on, and I'm still learning more about my family history as I go on. So, thank you.
Thank you, David. Thank you very much. Okay, so we don't have much time left now. We only have about 10 minutes. I don't know if Teresa or Rosemary have anything to add, or shall we give somebody the opportunity to speak?
Yeah.
Okay, so
just to say something that I think is important to say is that it's very emotional, but that's not a bad thing, because for many of us the emotions were killed off in a way.
So we are going to restrict it at the moment to, if anybody has any questions for Rosemary, Teresa or David, rather than give you the opportunity to tell your own story, because there simply is not time, but we will look to perhaps do that on a later date. So I'm not sure if there are any questions for any of our speakers at the moment.
Brink.
Okay, yes, I can see you. Let's see if we found you.
I just wanted to let you know, we went to the Weissensee Cemetery some years ago, and we were told there that the Nazis were scared of it. That's why they didn't destroy anything there.
That's interesting.
And I don't know if you know that there's been a really good film made about that cemetery.
Mm-hmm. No.
Yeah, I've got it upstairs on video.
Yeah.
I could give you more details. I don't know how I can pass you the details.
You could send them to Deborah and she could pass them on, I presume. Is that
Yeah.
all right, Deborah? Yeah.
Sure, if you email them into AJR, we'd be happy to pass them on.
I do that. It's a really interesting film. It's in German.
That's all right.
Okay. It's really
My German is very good,
Not so
but
good
that's
for me.
okay.
okay. And you may be aware that there was also a film made some years ago about the Rosenstrasse.
Oh, okay.
Yep. It's a film.
Yeah.
But it's based on fact, of course.
Yeah.
Okay. I just want to let you know.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
It was all new to me when I went.
Well, I'll send it. I have the film, but I had no way. If I go upstairs to get it, I'd have missed too much.
Yeah, no, email it into AJR and we'll pass the message on. It's good to share knowledge. Thank you.
What's your first name?
Patricia.
Ah, okay.
Okay, lovely. Thank you. Is anybody else? Tanya at the bottom. Alex, I'm struggling on my laptop to unmute, but we have a Tanya.
She's unmuted.
Oh, yes. I'm
Oh,
here.
lovely.
I guess for all three of you, I'm interested in, I don't know if you all have children, but I'm interested, given some of the emotional experiences as being brought up and not being told things or having things in the background, how important is it the next generation and the generations after to be brought up differently, either in Jewish families or either religious or not, on the emotional side of things, if that makes sense?
Do you want me to answer?
Yes, please, Teresa. Yeah.
It's interesting because I think it's not as simple as knowing and not knowing.
Yeah.
And I think also there's something about whether the next generation want to know or not. Because my sisters weren't interested. I have three sisters younger than me, and their relationship with our father was quite conflicted, as it was with our mother. And they never spent time wanting to know about that. But I think, how can I put this? These things are always emotionally laden. But I know what I was going to say quite often, and this might be a bit controversial, but one of the things I do know is sometimes in the next generations, there are illnesses which emerge on key dates, emotional illnesses and physical illnesses, which often relate to unknown key dates in the previous generation. For instance, I know of one person, this happens quite a lot in New Zealand, where somebody died of anorexia on the day her mother started a death march.
Wow.
That kind of thing. And that happens quite frequently. That's not. So I think it gets transmitted, and unless it can be talked about, it goes into a physical manifestation.
Thank you. Wow.
Lovely. Thank you, everybody, for keeping your questions nice and short so we can get more in. Anyone else? Jackie, I can only see half your name, but Jackie Constar something. Let's see. Alex, can you get to Jackie? Lovely. Jackie, you're unmuted.
I was just curious. Several of you, I think it was Rosemary who said it first, the physical manifestation of emotional. I mean, this is something that I've experienced, and I just wondered. I was curious to know when you begin to make the connection that you just don't think there's something physically the matter with you. That there's the connection between what has happened, or and what's going on in your body. That can't express itself emotionally. Well, I'm assuming you couldn't express itself emotionally. I'd just like to hear your your comments on that.
Shall I answer that one? Because I mentioned it. For years, I didn't know what was going on. I'm a professional singer, and I had this problem with deep breathing, which isn't a good thing. So for years, I had to negotiate it, because I would do deep breathing exercises and end up in floods of tears, and I had no idea why. And it was as I began to explore my second generation legacy that I was finally able to connect. I thought that I realized the two were connected. It was about grief, and even then at first I didn't, I thought it's about grief for my father's family, and I thought, why am I grieving? I never knew them, you know, that kind of thing. But it took a long time to make that connection, and a long time to work through it. I could understand it and therefore work with it better, but it didn't go away like that.
Yeah, yeah.
The interesting thing is Rosemary and I have the same symptom, and I discovered it when I joined a choir. The same thing.
Wow.
I have to manage it. It's very painful at times. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
Interesting.
Thanks. Yeah.
Okay, Eva Clark, yes, Eva Clark, please, Alex.
Hi. Okay, I'll be very brief. This is the first time I've ever attended a second generation meeting, and because I'm a survivor, but only by accident of birth, I do, in one sense, feel more of being a second generation person, because I was born in a concentration camp. And I just want to say that how moving I found all the presentations today. And I hope, I do know Gabby Glassman, and I hope that I can join in at some stage. That's all I wanted to say.
Thank you.
Well, we are looking to hold more sessions online with Gabby and other people as well. So as soon as we can get that organised, I hope it will be of interest. Okay, so one final question. I've got Vivian. Vivian? We'll just unmute you, and then I'm afraid you will be the last person to speak today.
Mute. Okay.
Here you go.
Yes, I would just like to find out from maybe Teresa or anyone that's spoken today that has got children. My two boys are in their 50s, and I've got 6 grandchildren, and I worry all the time, because it's in me all the time, thinking about what happened. I'm sort of constantly looking for answers all the time, and I also want to keep it going in the family when I'm gone, and I feel that I'm sort of nagging them. I don't know how to. They're not really that interested. I can't really explain. It's very upsetting, and I don't know how to deal with it.
You're doing the work. That's what's important.
I don't know how to do it. That's the thing. I mean, I've written this story, my story, or my mother's story, in the AJR, and then I got 6 copies, and I put them in envelopes, and I gave them to my sons and my grandchildren to keep. I hope they've read it, but I can't sort of push it down their throats. It's just...
It's time. You know, I was told a story in Australia by a woman who was not Jewish, but she was married to someone who was, and actually her father-in-law was also on the Dinero like my father, which is how I made contact. And she wrote a book about her father-in-law, and what precipitated that was her 2 sons doing a history project at school, and both chose this grandfather to interview. You know, okay. So I think there's something about
yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I would say, Vivian, that that, you know, you can't force anybody to do it. Obviously, you know, I've got 2 daughters. I couldn't understand why they weren't as interested as I thought they should be. And I think it just comes. It will come. You know, I think writing the story and putting it somewhere for when they're ready is a really good idea. And this is certainly something that we can talk about another time.
Great.
Because,
Thank you.
I think everybody who is second generation has children themselves will have things that they would like to discuss. It's a very big subject. So on that note, as we've been going for an hour, and it's such an emotional subject, and the sun is shining, and I think we need to, now's the time to say thank you very much to our 3 speakers today, and thank you all for listening. And oh, you get a round of applause. Very good.
Thank you all for listening. Thank you.
And yeah, if anybody wants contact details, then please contact us at AJR. You can email me, Deborah, as written there, at ajr.org.uk, or inquiries@ajr.org.uk, and we can pass on contact details if you'd like to find out more information. And otherwise, we will see you on another date. So thank you very much, and goodbye.